The Bible has long passages where nothing exciting happens. Just name after name of who came from who, rules about food, instructions on how to build a tent. And then, in the middle of it all, there is a guy who feels like he walked in from another story. His name is Melchizedek. He meets Abraham with bread and wine, blesses him, and leaves. That is it. No records of parents or children. He just vanishes after 3 verses. And somehow those 3 verses have kept scholars busy for 2,000 years. The theories about him are wild. Some say he was a local king, some say he was Shem, Noah's son, some say he was Christ before the incarnation. Others think he was a heavenly being who never died. When one man can be all of those things at once, you know you have hit on something strange. Melchizedek isn't a name you hear during Sunday school, yet he may be the most mind-boggling character in the Bible. Stay with me on this one because this is where the text leaves us with more questions than answers. If you read through the book of Genesis like a normal story, you probably got to chapter 14 and thought you were following the plot just fine. Abraham's nephew Lot was living in the city of Sodom. 4 kings showed up, battled 5 local kings, and Lot was taken prisoner with many people. News reached Abraham, and he decided he would not let this stand. He gathered his trained men, 318 of them, and pursued the invading kings all the way to the north. The odds were against him, but Abraham pulled off a victory. He struck the enemies at night, chased them down, and returned with Lot, the captives, and all the goods that had been taken. So far, this sounds like the kind of story you might expect in Genesis. Family loyalty, bravery in battle, divine favour. But then, right as Abraham comes back from victory, another king walks into the picture. His name is Melchizedek. He is called the King of Salem and priest of God Most High. The text does not explain why he shows up, or how he knew to meet Abraham, or what kind of connection existed between them. He is simply there, like a host greeting a returning guest. What Melchizedek does next is simple, yet loaded with meaning. He brings out bread and wine. In the ancient world, bread and wine were the staples of hospitality. They were basic foods that symbolized peace and fellowship. A king offering bread and wine to a victorious warrior was a sign of respect. But to later readers, especially Christians, this moment looked like much more. It resembled the bread and wine of communion, the central ritual of the church. Now, whether Melchizedek knew this was symbolic is impossible to say. From a historian's perspective, he was giving Abraham the normal welcome of the region. Yet the choice of bread and wine has kept people thinking. Of all the foods he could bring, why those 2? The pairing is simple but universal. Bread sustains. Wine lifts the spirit. Put together, they carry both life and joy. It's no surprise that later traditions saw this as a kind of foreshadowing. After offering bread and wine, Melchizedek blesses Abraham. His blessing is short but powerful. He praises Abraham's God, the Most High, who delivered Abraham's enemies into his hand. Notice what is happening here. Abraham has just returned from a battle. Victory in the ancient world was usually credited to military skill, numbers, or the favour of local gods. Yet Melchizedek makes it clear that the true reason for Abraham's success was divine help. He affirms that Abraham's God, whom he also serves, is above all. This is a meeting of 2 figures who recognise the same divine authority, even though one of them seems to have no link to Abraham's family or story. Then comes the most curious part. Abraham gives Melchizedek 1/10 of everything he gained. This is the first mention of a tithe in the Bible. Long before Moses, long before the Levitical system, Abraham sets aside 10% and gives it to this mysterious priest king. Think about what that means. Abraham is the father of Israel. He is the one God called out of Ur to form a new people. Yet here he bows in a sense to Melchizedek, handing him the portion that later became the standard offering to God. And then, as quickly as he appeared, Melchizedek vanishes from the page. That is all you get. Just a handful of verses. No background or genealogy. And no family tree telling you who his father or mother was. In the Bible, every important character usually has a story that stretches back or forward. You know who fathered whom, who they married, and who kept the family line going. But here is this strange priest king, seemingly without roots or branches. He steps into Abraham's story for only a moment, but it is enough to raise questions that have lasted thousands of years. The first odd thing is his title. He is not just a king, he is also a priest. Kings and priests were different roles in ancient Israel. A king ruled a city, or a nation, while priests belonged to the sacred tribe of Levi, long after Abraham's time. Melchizedek does not fit into either of these categories. He rules over Salem, which people later link to Jerusalem, and he's a priest of the Most High God at the same time. Not just any God, but El Elyon, a title often used in the Bible to describe the supreme God. To make it even stranger, after this brief encounter, Melchizedek disappears. Genesis goes on with Abraham's journey, and Melchizedek is gone. Hundreds of years pass, and he is mentioned only once more in the Old Testament, in Psalm 110, where King David writes that the coming Messiah will be a priest forever, in the order of Melchizedek. That is it. A total of 2 appearances in the Hebrew Bible. But when you turn to the New Testament, especially the book of Hebrews, Melchizedek suddenly takes center stage. The writer of Hebrews uses him as a comparison for Jesus Christ. Christ, they say, is not a priest like the Levites, but one who belongs to this older, mysterious order of Melchizedek, without beginning and without end. And just like that, a figure who was little more than a passing shadow in Genesis becomes one of the most intriguing symbols in Christian theology. This is why so many theologians, historians, and mystics have obsessed over him. He does not behave like a normal human character. His lack of genealogy is not an accident. It has the feel of deliberate silence, like the text wants you to notice that something is missing. When Melchizedek steps onto the stage with Abraham, he is not just called a priest, he is also named King of Salem. That title carries its own mystery. Salem is often linked with Jerusalem, the city that would later become the heart of Israel's religion and politics. Yet at this point in the story, Jerusalem does not exist as we know it. It is a hill country settlement, one of many in the land of Canaan. Calling Melchizedek the King of Salem places him at the center of something that feels older than the Bible itself. The word Salem sounds like shalom, the Hebrew word for peace. That is why many interpreters say the title means City of Peace. A king of peace blessing Abraham with bread and wine seems almost too symbolic. Some early Jewish sources leaned on this idea and said Melchizedek ruled over a peaceful city that reflected the order of heaven. Later Christian writers also took the name to mean peace and righteousness, making Melchizedek into an almost saintly ruler. But the picture gets more complicated when you look at Salem in the context of the ancient Near East. There was a Canaanite god named Shem, tied to dusk and the setting sun. Some historians think the name of the city may have been connected to this god, rather than to the Hebrew word for peace. If that is the case, Melchizedek's title as King of Salem may have carried religious weight that did not sound as pure to later readers. Instead of simply being the ruler of a peaceful town, he could have been the priest-king of a city tied to an old Canaanite deity. That makes the story even stranger. Why would the Bible present Abraham as paying respect to someone who came from such a background? One possible answer is that Salem was already seen as a sacred place long before Israel took it over. Archaeology shows that the hills around Jerusalem were occupied for thousands of years. By the time of Abraham, small fortified towns were common. These city-states often had rulers who acted both as kings and as priests. They were not just political leaders but also guardians of local shrines. In this light, Melchizedek fits the mold of the ancient priest-king, the type of leader who combined sacred and civic roles. The city-state system in Canaan helps make sense of the title. Each city had its own walls, farmland and temple. The king was the center of it all. He commanded warriors in battle, but he also offered sacrifices and kept the favor of the gods. This dual role was normal in Canaan, but it feels odd when you place it inside the Bible. Israel's later history drew sharp lines between king and priest. David ruled, the Levites performed sacrifices, and the two are not supposed to mix. Melchizedek stands out because he blends them. He is both king and priest, ruling over Salem while serving God Most High. That phrase, God Most High, also creates tension. Scholars point out that El Elyon was a title used in Canaanite religion for their high god El. In many traditions, El was the head of the pantheon, above Baal and the other deities. Some suggest that Melchizedek was a worshipper of El, and the biblical authors later equated El with the God of Israel. If true, then the scene with Abraham represents a meeting point between two traditions. Abraham's God and Melchizedek's God were seen as the same, even though they came from different cultural roots. This possibility makes the encounter all the more curious. Could it be that Melchizedek was just a Canaanite priest-king with a title and city that later happened to match Israel's holy city? Or was he part of an older spiritual tradition that the Bible only gives us glimpses of? What matters is that he is presented as a legitimate priest of the true God, even if his background would suggest otherwise. The text seems comfortable with the idea that God had a servant outside Abraham's family, ruling over a city that would later become the spiritual capital of Israel. British theologian Margaret Barker has argued that Melchizedek may represent an older Jerusalem priesthood, one that existed before the temple built by Solomon. She suggests that memories of this older priesthood survived and were folded into the figure of Melchizedek. If so, the king of Salem is not just a passing character, but the symbol of an ancient order, older than Israel itself. Harvard professor James Kugel also notes that stories like this were designed to anchor new traditions in older sacred places. By linking Abraham to the priest-king of Salem, the story ties Israel's father directly to Jerusalem before David ever set foot there. Looking at Salem as a city with deep roots makes the next part of Melchizedek's identity even harder to ignore. He is not only called a king, but also a priest. That single word, priest, changes everything. It suggests that he was part of a sacred role that usually came with strict rules and ancestry. Yet Melchizedek shows up before any of those systems even existed. In the Bible, the priesthood is normally tied to the tribe of Levi. Priests descended from Aaron, Moses' brother, and their job was to handle sacrifices, temple rituals, and the care of sacred spaces. They were not kings, they did not command armies. Their role was entirely focused on worship and offerings. But Melchizedek appears long before Levi was born. He is centuries earlier than the law of Moses, the temple, or the sacrificial system. This is what makes his priesthood stand apart. It feels like a separate order, one that does not depend on genealogy. This becomes clear in Psalm 110, a passage that, centuries later, gave Melchizedek an almost legendary aura. The psalm says, "You are a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek." The line is short, but it places Melchizedek into a category of his own. He is not part of the Levitical line. He belongs to something older and more permanent. The phrase forever also suggests something beyond the ordinary human lifespan. Unlike the priests of Levi, who lived and died, this order was seen as continuous. What does it even mean to belong to the order of Melchizedek? Some take it to mean that his priesthood was eternal, not bound by family trees. Others argue it was a poetic way of saying his role was unique and lasting in its influence. For Christians, this verse became the key to understanding the priesthood of Jesus. Since Jesus did not come from Levi, the early church turned to Melchizedek as the model. They said that Christ's priesthood was not limited to rituals or ancestry, but was eternal, just like the psalm described. From a historian's angle, you could say this is an example of interpretation filling a gap. The lack of genealogy in Genesis gave later writers freedom to read more into it. James Kugel often said that these gaps were what fueled Jewish interpretation. The silence about Melchizedek's origins left space for imagination. If that is true, Psalm 110 is not just poetry, but a survival of something ancient, remembered in fragments. The fascination with Melchizedek's priesthood also comes from the way it challenges religious boundaries. Most priesthoods are exclusive. You need the right family line, the right temple, and the right rituals. Melchizedek does not fit that mold. He is chosen outside the normal lines. That makes him both attractive and unsettling. If God could establish a priesthood before Levi, could he not do it again? This question kept both Jews and Christians debating for centuries. It's also worth pointing out how people imagined the order of Melchizedek outside of Scripture. In some mystical traditions, especially in Kabbalah, the priesthood was linked to heavenly realms. Melchizedek was seen as the high priest of a cosmic temple, not limited to earth. Gnostic writings also picked up the theme, calling him a figure of hidden knowledge. These groups treated the order of Melchizedek as a mystery school, a channel of wisdom that was older than Moses. It is also striking how the order is described as forever. In the ancient world, forever was often used as a way of expressing permanence, not literal eternity. Kings promised to rule forever, though they obviously did not. Yet in this case, the forever became central to later interpretations. If Melchizedek's priesthood was forever, then it had to be something more than human. Professor Michael E. Stone points out that the way Melchizedek was transformed in Jewish apocalyptic texts shows how fluid traditions were at the time. A short biblical note could grow into an entire cosmic role. The priesthood of Melchizedek is a prime example of how ideas could expand. What began as a simple blessing in Genesis grew into a doctrine of eternal priesthood. When you think about it, the priesthood of Melchizedek also raises questions about authority. Who gets to speak for God? Who gets to offer sacrifices and blessings? The Levitical priests had rules and regulations. Melchizedek did not. His authority came from somewhere else, unrecorded and unexplained. That mystery is what gave him power in later thought. If his order was higher than Levi's, then it could serve as a foundation for new interpretations of priesthood, especially in times of change. When the priesthood of Melchizedek is left hanging in scripture, later Jewish tradition quickly moved to fill in the gaps. His short appearance in Genesis and the brief reference in Psalms were not enough for communities who wanted answers. They began to imagine who he really was and why he mattered. That is why Melchizedek shows up again in writings outside the main biblical texts. One of the most striking examples is found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. These scrolls, discovered in caves near Qumran in the middle of the 20th century, contained a wide mix of Jewish writings from the Second Temple period. Among them was a text often called 11Q Melchizedek. There's more to the Dead Sea than the scrolls alone. Beneath its waters and along its shores are stories of treasures, hidden chambers, and mysteries that most people never hear about. I did a full video exploring those secrets, and I'll leave it for you at the end so you can have a look once we're done here. Back to the 11Q Melchizedek. This document paints Melchizedek in an entirely new light. Instead of being just a priest-king who shared bread and wine with Abraham, he is presented as a heavenly figure, almost like an angel or even higher. In 11Q Melchizedek, he appears at the end of days to proclaim liberty for the oppressed and to announce the year of God's favour. He takes on the role of a deliverer who defeats the forces of darkness and brings judgment. He is described with language that the Bible usually reserves for God himself. For example, the scroll calls him the one who will carry out vengeance and redeem people from their sins. That is not a small upgrade from Genesis. It is a complete transformation. Melchizedek becomes a cosmic agent of God's justice. Why would the writers of Qumran think this way? The community that produced the scrolls was obsessed with end-time battles and heavenly visions. They saw themselves as living in the last days, surrounded by corruption, waiting for divine intervention. For them, Melchizedek fit perfectly as a champion from above. He was mysterious enough in scripture to be molded into this role. His lack of genealogy and his title as priest of God Most High made him a ready candidate for a cosmic redeemer. This interpretation also tells us how fluid tradition was in that period. A couple of verses in Genesis can grow into a full teaching about the end of the world. Michael Stone has pointed out that this growth of ideas was common in Jewish apocalyptic writings. Gaps in the biblical text invited creative expansions. Melchizedek became more than history. He became a hope for the future. While the Dead Sea Scrolls cast him in almost divine terms, rabbinic literature took another route. Rabbis were less concerned with turning him into a heavenly being and more concerned with grounding his identity. Many rabbinic sources suggest that Melchizedek was actually Shem, the son of Noah. Shem had lived through the flood, blessed by God, and was believed by some traditions to have lived for centuries afterward. If Shem was still alive in Abraham's time, then calling him Melchizedek could make sense. This solved two problems for the rabbis. First, it explained how Melchizedek could already be a priest of God before Abraham. If he were Shem, then he came from the line that carried the knowledge of the true God after the flood. Second, it preserved the idea that priesthood was tied to the patriarchs and not random outsiders. By making Melchizedek into Shem, the rabbis kept the story within the family line. Still, not all agreed with this view. Some rabbis hinted that Melchizedek had misused his priesthood. A few said he lost his right to offer sacrifices because he blessed Abraham before blessing God. Others pointed out that the priesthood was taken from him and given to Abraham's line. These interpretations were attempts to explain why Melchizedek fades so quickly from the story. They made him important but not eternal. In Jewish thought, The question of priesthood was never just abstract. It was tied to real debates about authority. During the Second Temple period, different groups argued over who had the true priestly line. The Sadducees claimed authority through their control of the temple in Jerusalem. The Pharisees emphasized oral traditions and purity laws. The Qumran community rejected the temple system altogether and looked for a new order. In this environment, Melchizedek's shadowy priesthood became a useful tool. Each group could use its figure to support its own claims. The fascination with him also reflects the broader trend of Second Temple Judaism to expand on mysterious characters. Enoch was another prime example. He was barely mentioned in Genesis, yet by the time of these writings, he had been turned into a heavenly scribe who walked among angels. Melchizedek followed a similar path. Silence in the text gave rise to entire worlds of interpretation. Jewish tradition had already stretched Melchizedek into larger roles, but Christianity took him even further. The moment came with the Epistle to the Hebrews, a New Testament letter written for believers who were struggling with their identity. They needed to understand why Jesus mattered when so many around them still pointed to the temple in Jerusalem and its priests. The author of Hebrews found the answer in the old figure of Melchizedek. The letter highlights how strange Melchizedek was in Genesis. He appears without father or mother, without genealogy, and without beginning or end. For the writer, this silence was not just a curiosity. It was proof that Melchizedek's priesthood was different. It was eternal, in a way that ordinary priests could never be. This made him the perfect figure to compare with Jesus. The priests of Levi served for a time and then died. Their work was never complete because sacrifices had to be repeated day after day. Jesus, on the other hand, was presented as a priest forever, offering one sacrifice that covered everything. To explain this, the author of Hebrews said that Jesus was a priest not in the order of Aaron, but in the order of Melchizedek. It was a way of saying that his authority was older and greater. This connection solved a key problem. Jesus was from the tribe of Judah, not Levi. By law, he had no right to be a priest. Yet by linking him to Melchizedek, the letter argued that he belonged to a higher priesthood, one that was not bound by tribal lines. The psalm about a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek, became the bridge. It allowed early Christians to claim that their Messiah held the true eternal priesthood, even if he did not fit the usual rules. By drawing a line from Psalm 110 to Genesis 14 to Jesus, the author of Hebrews gave new meaning to old words. It was not about literal genealogy, but about symbolic continuity. The comparison also added layers of mystery to Jesus. He was not just a teacher or prophet, he was tied to a priesthood that seemed timeless. Margaret Barker has argued that the Melchizedek connection shows that early Christians were aware of older temple traditions that had been suppressed. For them, Jesus was not creating something new out of nothing. He was restoring a forgotten order that stretched back before Levi. This interpretation shaped the way different Christian traditions later understood Jesus' role. In Catholicism, the link between Melchizedek and Jesus became central to the understanding of the Eucharist. When Melchizedek brought out bread and wine for Abraham, Catholics saw in that a foreshadowing of the bread and wine of the Mass. The priest at the altar was seen as participating in the eternal priesthood of Christ, which itself was connected back to Melchizedek. That is why in Catholic liturgy, Melchizedek's name is still remembered. In the Orthodox tradition, the emphasis was less on legal arguments and more on mystery. The eternal priesthood of Christ was seen as part of the divine plan that transcended time. Melchizedek was honoured as the type of Christ, a shadow pointing to the real thing. Icons often depict Melchizedek as an old man offering bread and wine, standing as a symbol of the eternal sacrifice. For Orthodox believers, this was not just history but a window into divine mystery. Even Protestants, after breaking from Catholic teaching, still found meaning in Melchizedek. For reformers like German theologian Martin Luther, the focus was on Christ's superiority to the Levitical priesthood. They argued that no human priest could stand between God and man because Christ alone was the eternal priest. In this view, Melchizedek became evidence that the old system of temple sacrifices had been replaced once and for all. Even today, different branches of Christianity continue to debate what the order of Melchizedek really means. Some see it as a poetic way of describing Christ's eternal nature. Others treat it as a literal priesthood that extends beyond human rules. Still others have taken it in more mystical directions. linking it to hidden orders of wisdom or secret societies that claim to descend from Melchizedek's line. There is also a subtle irony here. In Genesis, Melchizedek appears only briefly, offering bread and wine and receiving a tithe. He is almost a background figure. Yet in Christian theology, he became one of the most important links in explaining who Jesus was. His silence became his power. The less the Bible said about him, the more space there was for interpretation. That space was filled not only by official theology, but also by fringe ideas. Over the centuries, groups claimed to belong to the order of Melchizedek, treating it as a secret lineage of priests who carried hidden knowledge. Some esoteric traditions linked it to mystical teachings, suggesting that Melchizedek represented a universal priesthood that transcended religions. Whether or not these claims had substance, they show how enduring the mystery of the order was. For mainstream Christianity, though, the focus remains on the eternal priesthood of Christ. Catholic Mass, Orthodox liturgy, and Protestant preaching all, in their own ways, tied Jesus back to Melchizedek. He was the model that proved priesthood could exist outside Levi, that bread and wine could hold sacred meaning, and that the Messiah's role was both kingly and priestly. It is worth noting that the comparison also sets Christianity apart from Judaism. In Jewish thought, Melchizedek was intriguing, but not central. In Christianity, he became a cornerstone of theological argument. This difference shows how traditions can split from the same text and go in completely different directions. One faith treated him as a fascinating side figure. The other built a central doctrine on his name. Traditions outside Judaism and Christianity were also quick to pick him up and shape Melchizedek into something that fit their own ideas. In Islam, his name does not appear in the Quran, but some teachers in the Sufi world drew lines between him and Khidr. Khidr is the mysterious guide who never seems to die and appears only when someone needs direction. He shows up, gives knowledge, and disappears again. The similarity is easy to see. Melchizedek also appears without background, blesses Abraham, and vanishes. For Sufis, both figures stood as proof that God sends teachers who do not fit normal categories. They are not tied to one tribe or one temple. They belong to something older and hidden. The Gnostics took the same mystery and pushed it further. In the writings found at Nag Hammadi in Egypt, Melchizedek is not simply a man. He is a cosmic priest, part of a heavenly system of light and truth. Some texts even treat him as a direct counterpart to Christ, not a symbol, but a real presence in the divine order. Gnostics loved figures who blurred the line between human and eternal. Melchizedek gave them exactly that. His lack of story in Genesis allowed them to imagine him as a ruler of the higher realms, untouched by the flaws of earthly religion. In Jewish mysticism, the figure of Melchizedek shows up again, this time in Kabbalistic thought. His name, which can be read as King of Righteousness, made him a natural fit for mystical systems that organized divine qualities into patterns. Some writers placed him as a channel of justice and balance in the spiritual world. Instead of being remembered as the king of a small Canaanite town, he became a principle within creation itself. The Kabbalists were less concerned with his history and more with what his name and role could mean in a cosmic sense. What stands out is how each tradition saw something different, but worked with the same fragments. The Quran never names him, but Sufis saw him in Khidr. The Bible barely mentions him, but Gnostics made him ruler of light. Kabbalists took his title and turned it into a cosmic quality. Melchizedek is not the only figure who appears and disappears with little explanation. The Bible itself has a few others who share the same pattern of mystery. Looking at them side by side shows that this type of character was not unique, and it may help explain why Melchizedek gained such weight in later thought. The first is Elijah. His story is longer, but his ending is abrupt. He is taken up into heaven in a whirlwind with chariots of fire. His disciple Elisha watches as he disappears into the sky. Elijah never dies in the usual sense, and Jewish tradition later taught that he would return as a forerunner of the Messiah. Again, we see a figure who avoids normal human limits. Melchizedek, who has no record of birth or death, fits into the same pattern. Outside the Bible, other cultures also produced priest kings and sages who carried the same aura. Hermes Trismegistus in Greek and Egyptian thought was said to be both a king and a teacher of divine wisdom. Some treated him as a human who was later elevated, others as a god who appeared in human form. Zoroaster, the ancient Persian prophet, was also remembered as a figure who brought sacred knowledge, and was wrapped in myth about his origins and destiny. These parallels show that the idea of a mysterious guide or ruler was not limited to one tradition. World mythology is filled with sages who appear briefly, deliver wisdom, and vanish. Some never die, others are said to return in times of crisis. They often stand at the edge of history and legend, with just enough detail to make them feel real and just enough silence to make them feel eternal. Melchizedek stands firmly in this category. He is remembered not for long speeches or great battles, but for the mystery of his presence. From here, it's easy to see how he fits into a larger group of figures whose presence feels more symbolic than historical. Seeing Melchizedek alongside figures like Enoch, Elijah, and sages from other traditions makes it clear that he belongs to a class of mysterious characters who seem bigger than the stories that hold them. But unlike Enoch or Elijah, Melchizedek has been pressed into the center of theological debates for centuries. This has forced historians, biblical scholars, and researchers to ask whether he was ever meant to be more than a narrative detail. For critical scholars, the starting point is always the text of Genesis. Melchizedek's scene is short, almost abrupt. He arrives, blesses Abraham, and then fades. Many argue that this looks like a fragment of an older tradition inserted into the Abraham story. Some researchers describe these kinds of gaps and insertions as signals of editing. According to this view, the Melchizedek passage may have been preserved because it carried weight in Jerusalem's religious memory, and later writers folded it into the patriarchal story. This theory connects with the idea that Salem was an early form of Jerusalem. By linking Abraham with the priest-king of that place, the writers could give legitimacy to Jerusalem's role as the center of worship. In this sense, Melchizedek was less about mystery and more about politics. He was a way of saying that even the patriarch honored the priesthood of Jerusalem. Scholars who lean this way often point to the practical function of stories in ancient texts. They were not neutral. They supported claims of land, kingship, and sacred authority. For scholars who go further and suggest that the meeting with Abraham was not about a real exchange, but about a symbolic link between righteousness and the patriarch, this makes Melchizedek a literary figure rather than a man. Critics of the literary theory point out that the text treats him as a real king in a real city. Abraham gives him a tithe, which was a common ancient practice. If he were just a symbol, why include such ordinary details? The argument makes it clear how tricky it is to tell history from theology in something written so long ago. When you get to Psalm 110, the picture grows more layered. It speaks of a priest forever, in the order of Melchizedek. Many scholars see this as a royal psalm tied to the Davidic kings, possibly used to show that the king of Jerusalem was not only a political leader but also a priest. In that sense, Melchizedek was invoked as precedent, not praise for his own sake, but to support the king's authority. Scholar Margaret Barker suggests this verse may preserve traces of an older Jerusalem priesthood that existed before the temple system. She argues it recalls a time when the king also acted as priest, a tradition later reforms tried to erase. If so, the mystery of Melchizedek is really cultural memory breaking through after centuries of change, a suppressed tradition hiding in plain sight. Not all scholars are convinced by mystical or theological readings. Some take a very skeptical stance. They argue that Melchizedek was simply a priest of the Canaanite high god El, and the biblical writers later identified El with the God of Israel. This would make the story of Abraham's tithe a moment of religious crossover. The strange thing, of course, is that the text accepts Melchizedek as a legitimate priest. It does not condemn him as a pagan. This has led some to suggest that early Israelite religion was closer to Canaanite practice than later traditions admit. This kind of view can be unsettling, but it also fits with what we know of ancient religion. Boundaries were not as sharp as later theology made them. God shared titles, shrines shifted hands, and priest-kings could be reinterpreted in new ways. Melchizedek may have been remembered precisely because his story was useful for reshaping the past in the light of later beliefs. There are also readers who look closely at Hebrews and its use of Melchizedek. Critics note that Hebrews pushes the symbolism very far. It reads the silence of Genesis as evidence of eternity, which is a leap. For many scholars, this is a case of creative exegesis. The author of Hebrews was not describing historical reality, but building a theological argument. The claim that Jesus belonged to the order of Melchizedek worked because the figure was so undefined. It allowed flexibility. Professor of Old Testament interpretation Dr. Peter Gentry pushes back against the idea that Melchizedek was a pre-incarnate Christ. He says the Genesis story should be read at face value, as a record of an actual priest-king who ruled Salem.
It's not that Melchizedek was an eternal person, it's the way the author of Genesis presents him. It makes it feasible for him to be a model or pattern of the coming Messiah. And he is not a Christophany, he's not a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ, he's an actual historical individuals. Didn't have very much information about the ancient Near Eastern background. They didn't have very much information about the development of Canaanite religion. And because of the statements in the book of Hebrews, they misunderstood the author of the book of Hebrews to be suggesting that Melchizedek was a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ, which is not what the author to the Hebrews is actually saying.
Modern researchers often return to the same point. The mystery of Melchizedek is less about who he was and more about how later communities used him. He became a mirror for their hopes, their politics, and their theology. For Jews, he could be Shem, a patriarch who kept priesthood in the family. For the Qumran sect, he was a cosmic judge. For Christians, he was the prototype of Christ. For skeptics, he was a local priest rebranded in Scripture. Each reading says as much about the community that produced it as about the man himself. Yet even scholars who take the most critical stance admit that Melchizedek is unusual. Few other biblical figures are so undefined. The silence about his parents and his death is striking. Some argue it is literary design. Others say it reflects a fragment of myth preserved in the text. Either way, it is not normal, and that abnormality is what has kept him alive in debate. Sometimes Scripture speaks just as loudly through what it leaves unsaid. Gaps are not always mistakes. At times they are openings, giving us a glimpse of something older or bigger than the official account. Melchizedek feels like one of those openings. He points back to a memory of priest kings in Jerusalem before the tribe of Levi. He points to a link between Israel's God and the wider world of Canaanite religion. He points to the way history and myth may have blended together in the minds of ancient writers. When I think about Melchizedek, I care less about solving who he was, and more about what his story shows. It shows that Scripture is not a smooth, polished surface. It has gaps and silences, traces of older traditions that were never fully erased. It shows that across the centuries, people wrestled with those gaps and filled them with meaning. And it shows that some of the most powerful truths in sacred texts are the ones left unsaid, waiting for each generation to find again. Earlier I mentioned the Dead Sea Scrolls. If you really want to see how deep this mystery goes, that video's waiting right here.